No one really saw what was coming. Like the round pebble taken from the young shepherd's pouch, flung into the skull of the invincible giant Goliath, history would never be quite the same again. A century ago, in a remote part of Eastern Europe, on June the 28th, 1914, the anniversary coming up this Thursday, we will mark that momentous day when a shot was fired that would forever change the known world. You probably don't know the name of the little guy who fired the shot. He may not have had the same infamy of the old soldier folk tale that we read in King David's in Scripture today, but he may in fact be the most important individual of the 20th century, certainly one little person who changed the course of the world by one precise shot. Just in case we might dismiss the David and Goliath story as the exaggeration of old soldiers' tales or the reinterpretation of myth, this week marks an important moment in our own self-understanding as human beings. It is itself a more fantastic tale than the tale of David and Goliath. In a cigarette-smoke-filled cafe in Belgrade in 1914, a group of Slavic and Serbian youth, most of whom had not seen their 20th birthdays, gathered to ponder the plight of their families and peoples. For centuries and generations, the Slavs had been treated as underdogs by the larger nations who had swallowed them up, their lands and their identity. From 500 years under the Muslim Turks, they were now the underlings, a province of the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire. The cry for justice and human liberation echoed throughout the world, from the failed rebellions in Ireland to the continents of Africa and India seeking self-determination from their European overlords. A newspaper cutting sat on the cafe's table, announcing the forthcoming visit of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, the heir of the mighty empire that continued to deny Bosnia-Herzegovina its long respected for independence. He was the Prince Charles of his day, the heir apparent. He was sympathetic to the Slav cause. He was coming to Sarajevo to try and work things out. And being a very proud military man himself, he refused to take any significant precautions during his state visit to protect himself. He chooses instead an open limousine to drive with his wife, Sophia. It is their wedding anniversary, so that the people might see him in his bright blue uniform and green feathered hat. What we would call today a local terrorist cell seized the opportunity to show their distaste of this flagrant show of overconfident Austro-Hungarian imperialism. And a handful of these young nationalist assassins were hired to mingle with the crowds that day, some with grenades, some with pistols. And the route was well publicized, this military parade welcoming the Archduke. When the day finally came, as the Archduke's car drove down one of the main streets of Sarajevo, one of these young assassins threw a grenade and it bounced against his car and exploded under the car behind. He drove to City Hall and he complained to the country's leadership, "What is the good of your speeches? I come to Sarajevo on a visit and I get bombs thrown at me. It is outrageous." So it looks as if the assassins' work was over and they had failed. But by chance, the Archduke's car, now returning to the palace, took a wrong turning into a street, and the driver was directed to stop, reverse, and move back into the parade route. And in that instant, another assassin, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, was loitering on the corner, and he shot the two royal visitors at point-blank range and tried unsuccessfully to turn the gun on himself. The assassination of the Archduke and Sophie set off a rapid chain of events that nobody was expecting. Austria-Hungary, like many countries around the world, blamed the Serbian government for the attack and hoped to use the incident as justification for settling the question of Slav nationalism once and for all. And as Russia supported Serbia, an Austro-Hungarian declaration of war was delayed until its leaders received assurances from the German leader Kaiser Wilhelm that Germany would support their cause in the event that Russia intervened. And that would likely involve Russia's allies of France and possibly Britain as well. So on the 28th of July, only a month later, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the tenuous peace between Europe's great powers collapsed. Within a week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia had lined up against Austria-Hungary and Germany, and World War I had begun. I'm really very interested in this 100th anniversary of the ending of the First World War, and I'm reading a lot around it. And there's a very interesting book by Malcolm Brown, who's part of the researchers at the Imperial War Library, and it's called The First World War, 1914, The Men Who Went to War. And unlike the fairy tale romanticized story of David and Goliath in the Bible, Brown writes from actual written diaries and letters and publications of the time, real, ordinary people who ended up in those trenches fighting one another. And one day they had normal lives, and the next day they were at war. And so Brown concludes that many of these profound personal accounts were clearly written for us to learn something. And he said there's clearly a story that these men needed to tell us, either through the sharing of their experiences as they were writing home to loved ones, or to posterity. He says this: "What I do know is that I have found again and again a deep urge on the part of countless people in the front line of war, whatever their rank or indeed their sex, to get across to anyone who might read their writings what it was they were going through. They wanted to bear witness, to be heard." And he goes on to summarize what he sees. The important fact that all the countries involved went to war supremely confident in the righteousness of their cause. Most wars begin with the belief that God is on everybody's side. This one arguably more than most. It should not be assumed that because the Germans began the war by marching into France and Belgium, that they saw themselves as the wicked invaders. On the contrary, they believed they were launching a preemptive strike against countries which it was assumed were bound to attack them sooner or later. And he quotes a saying attributed to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who says this: "The Holy Spirit has descended on me because I am Emperor of the Germans. I am the instrument of the Most High. I am his sword, his representative." And in a similar yet more ordinary quote from a diary of a British soldier fighting in Mesopotamia, he says, "Who dies for England sleeps with God." So Brown comments, when such certainties meet head to head, the possibilities of a cataclysmic result occurring are high, and it duly occurred. So in reading today's text, it would be irresponsible for any preacher to allow this romanticized, idealized form of holy war and hero warrior worship to go without significant qualification. Some of the most violent and repugnant misuse of holy text can happen when we fail to qualify these stories in the way that I'm trying to do this morning. And it may be that the better form of discernment between, on the one hand, the glorification of war and the mythologizing of heroes and events can only really be tempered with the actual accounts of war, written by the men and women who witnessed firsthand both its brutality and madness, as well as sacrifice and heroism. Old soldiers wishing for the peace of normalcy often do not want to talk about their experiences. And this was one of the factors that actually led to the First World War. It had been almost 50 years since Europe had been engaged in conflict. So they didn't really know what they were talking about. And as young men went to sign up and to go to the front and fight for king and country, women were passing out white feathers on the streets of London if you were not in uniform. And so not to go and fight was somehow not very manly. And so in this book, we learn about the naivety of the people who signed up in those first few months. We learn how diplomacy somehow failed, that no one saw this coming. And there is a sense of kind of unreality. War was declared and people were still on vacation. This is only going to last a few months. Maybe it will be fought at sea. We'll just conquer a couple of cities. It's going to be easy. They had no idea what was coming. Europe leapt off a cliff that would totally change the world. And it would mean the powers responded to Princeps' assassination of the Archduke and his wife 104 years ago this Thursday. In his book, The Great War for Civilization, the journalist Robert Fisk recalls his father, Bill Fisk, taking him around the trenches of France and talking about his experience, his story, what the war was like for him on the Western Front. And it's from this detail, this engagement with his father, that Robert Fisk becomes this major journalist and war correspondent. And a way in which he sees the importance of detail, of person, of place, and holding governments and corporations accountable for war and for the abuse of power. He believes that good journalism is the first imprint in writing history. And he also learned from his father that many of the conflicts he would cover in his career in the 20th century began in that fateful European summer in 1914. The junior Fisk would cover conflicts in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Ireland, and in the Middle East. And the graves of colonial troops and locals would be reminders that these contemporary conflicts were not new. Here we were again as hordes of human beings spiraling through these crossroads of the world, these places marked by greed and violence and oppression and a deep sacrificial longing to be free. And he writes this: "If I feel this personally, it is because I have witnessed events that over the years can only be defined as the arrogance of power. The Iranians used to call the United States as the center of world arrogance. And I would laugh at this, but I've begun to understand what it means. After the Allied victory in 1918, the end of my father's war, the victors divided up the lands of their former enemies. In the space of just 17 months, they created the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the Middle East. And I have spent my entire career in Belfast, in Sarajevo, in Beirut and Baghdad, watching the people within those borders burn. America invaded Iraq not for Saddam Hussein's mythical weapons of mass destruction, which had long ago been destroyed, but to change the map of the Middle East, much as my father's generation had done 80 years before. Even as it took place, Bill Fisk's war was helping to produce the century's first genocide, that of 1.5 million Armenians, laying the foundations for a second, that of the Jews of Europe." And this is what Fisk concludes. "In 1992, I was in Sarajevo, and once as Serb shells whiffed over my head, I stood upon the very paving stone upon which Gavrilo Princip stood as he fired the fatal shot that sent my father to the trenches of the First World War. And of course, the shots were still being fired in Sarajevo in 1992. It was as if history was a gigantic echo chamber." It was as if history was a gigantic echo chamber. So what do we make of this? How do we break these patterns and cycles of violence in this echo chamber of our world? And we may find a little glimmers of hope in the other two readings that are linked to the David and Goliath story today. And in them we find descriptions of terror, of fear, of blame, the plea from the disciples in the boat filling with water on the tempest, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? Do something." And in the letter written to the Christians in Corinth 2,000 years ago, Paul himself is no stranger to violence or despair or character assassination or even the seizing of his freedom. When he wrote this letter, he had probably been in prison 7 times. And because of what he believed in. The theologian St. John Chrysostom is commenting on Paul's, in this text from Corinthians, and he describes Paul's list as the blizzard of troubles. It's a great phrase. This blizzard of troubles that Paul is talking about. All the calamities that can happen to him, indeed, were still happening to him. And Paul begins with the most important phrase in the whole passage. He talks about endurance. And the Greek word is hupomene. And it's a difficult word to fully translate because it describes a kind of inner strength and ability to bear all these negative forces and somehow transmute them, almost reversing its power to destroy the body and the spirit. Chrysostom describes this human and Christian endurance as, quote, "the root of all good, the mother of all piety, the fruit that never withers, a fortress that is never taken, a harbor that knows no storms." He calls it the queen of all virtues, the foundation of right actions, peace in war, calm in tempest, security in plots. And it is the kind of courageous and triumphant ability that enables a man or woman to pass the breaking point and not to break. It is the magic force that transmutes tribulation and chaos into strength and a deep peace. That kind of image of Jesus, peace be still. And so we find Paul is trying to describe to his readers the way we can overcome the pressures and the storms of life, the things that worry and oppress us. As Fisk describes this arrogance of power that we still see in our world, in our national life, and in one another's lives. Paul invites those who follow Jesus not to seek vengeance or even self-protection, but he lists human qualities to help us break these cycles of self and national destruction. And he lists purity, knowledge, patience, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech. And these are the only weapons that are to be used by the followers of Jesus. The weapons of righteousness, he calls them. Used in honor and in dishonor, in ill repute and good repute. So these are the weapons. And it's a kind of whole reversal of that holy war image that we have in the first reading. It's very interesting, one of the central conflicts in the early Christian movement, and even in the world today, is the idea that the Messiah is going to be a warrior. That was a very early conflict. And a lot of the disciples, they wanted this warrior Jesus, and he wasn't a warrior in that sense. And many Christians in the world today, they think, Jesus didn't get it right the first time, and so he's coming back with his army to make us all good. And it all comes from that story of the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. and that story. And how do we interpret that today in a way that honors both the story and also puts it in a different context? Paul concludes his wisdom to the Corinthians with the image of the heart being wide open. There is no restriction in our affections, and he invites them to open their hearts also. And this, I believe, is the Christian's answer of how we should not only be in the world, not in some kind of idealized, pious way, but as in Paul's case, to be our response even when the world is crushing us and persecuting us, our own forms of blizzards of troubles. That steady endurance to love and to hold the world in reality in such a way that this world may grow into its highest potential. Endurance, holy endurance, that will not surrender to the darkness. Even the things that we don't like about ourselves or see what is done in the name of God or of national security, however we name it, and the transformation of that darkness and violence and human cruelty that we see and read about and watch on our televisions every day. Lord, have mercy. Do you not care that we perish? So I hope as we open the scriptures today that we find, and as we remember this anniversary that is coming up, and as we reflect, I encourage you to pay more attention to what the First World War was about and what we can learn from it. And rather than to repeat in the same mistakes in this echo of history, that we learn from it and that we learn the antidote of purity and knowledge and patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power and endurance of God is with us.